Your long-term investments are where you really build trust. That's your podcast, that's your blog, that's your YouTube channel, where people are spending time with you. And those people, like we talked about earlier, are more likely to trust you enough to actually click on that contact button.
Are you ready to make your law firm a profit-generating machine that will free up your time and skyrocket your impact? With more than 2 decades of business growth experience and having proven that you can be successful while prioritizing your family and your impact, introducing the Profit with Law podcast. I am your host, the creator of the Firm Differentiator 10X Effect, Moshe Amsel. Well, hello and welcome to another amazing guest interview here on the Profit with Law podcast. I'm your host, Moshe Amsel, and I'm excited for today's episode. Why am I excited? I'll tell you why. Because I've been listening to podcasts from back when I needed to download an episode on iTunes and synchronize it with my iPod to play through my FM transmitter in my car when I was driving around. And I was some of the early shows I listened to were Michael Hyatt. It was called This Is Your Life. He's still doing podcasts, but that's not the name of the show anymore. But I still have the jingle in my head. This is your life. And then I had Pat Flynn in my ears, and of course Cliff Ravenscraft, who's my podcast mentor. So I'm obviously an avid podcast listener, and then I have my own show. And I believe in podcast as a medium, or I wouldn't be getting behind a microphone every single week with interviews and the solo episodes that I do. And you wouldn't be here listening to the show if you didn't believe in podcasts, at least in some way, shape, or form, right? So podcast is a wonderful medium because it's one of those things that you can listen to passively while you're practically doing anything. I mean, I listen to podcasts when I'm out for a run, when I'm going on a bike ride. I listen to podcasts when I'm washing dishes. I listen to podcasts when I'm sitting in my kid's room because he keeps waking up and I just need to be present in the room and I can't do anything else. I'm kind of stuck there. I listen to podcasts when I'm in the shower. Unfortunately, I have to slow it down to 1x speed when I do that, because then it's in public and my wife can't stand when I listen to it on super fast speed. But I consume a ton of content, and I'm only able to do that because it's audio content. If I was sitting there on YouTube, I'd have to be watching the videos. And that's why I love podcasts as a medium. I love audio as a medium. And it's evergreen. It's always there. You can always get to it. So why am I talking about podcasts? Why am I talking about my history with podcasts? Because our guest today is somebody who helps you implement podcasting in your marketing scheme, marketing plan. And I'm excited to jump into a conversation with him about the benefits and why you should think about doing this and how easy it can be. So let me introduce our guest. Our guest is Danny Ozment. He is the founder of Emerald City Productions. Danny is a business strategist and podcast consultant for busy professionals. Solopreneurs who want to create podcasts that build brand loyalty and make their marketing efforts more effective. Danny's refreshing approach as the owner of Emerald City Productions has made him a sought-after speaker, online educator, and consultant for major corporations and thought leaders. His clients include Salesforce, LinkedIn, the John Maxwell team, Mike Cam, and I have no idea how to pronounce the Julius Group. He is the host of the highly rated podcast, Podcast Strategies for Growing Your Business Community and Influence. He has spoken at industry-leading events, including Podcast Movement and Mediavine. And interestingly enough, when we were in the green room before we got started, he said, "Oh, you didn't get my email, blah, blah, blah." And I searched my email for his name, and I found that my good friend Mark Homer over at GNGF did a intro to Danny back in June of 2020, I think it was, or sometime in 2020, basically saying, "Hey, I think this would be somebody good to have at your law firm growth summit." I don't know whatever happened with that intro, but somehow if we finally, our stars have aligned, we've connected, and here we are on this show to record the next 30 minutes of goodness for you. So Danny, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
All right, here's that easy question for you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. There's our listeners probably never heard of you. Some of them may have, but some of them, a lot of them probably have not heard of you. They want to know a little bit more about Danny. I gave you the official bio, but give us the real story. How in the world did you end up getting involved in podcast production and helping business owners with their marketing in this way? What was your path to get here?
Yeah, well, Moshe, thank you again for having me. And I love the way you introduced podcasting at the beginning, because I often start out my talks with a big slide that says you've been naked together. Because I tell people, like, raise your hands. How many of you listen to a podcast in the shower? How many of you listen to a podcast while you were sitting on the toilet? And that always gets a nice laugh. But that's why podcasting is wonderful, and I love it. You're definitely a power user of podcasts. The time you've been around and some of the things that you shared. I came to podcasting sort of in the same way. I always wanted to be a musician, so much so that I have a master's degree in orchestral conducting. Spent about 10 years in the nonprofit arts world in Washington, D.C., working at the Kennedy Center and the National Cathedral. And in 2008, my daughter was born. Actually, today is her birthday that we're recording. She turned 15 today.
What's her name?
Her name is Elena. And
Elena, happy birthday, Elena.
I appreciate that. I'll share this with her.
You tell her, go listen to this show. Like,
yeah, she's like, I'm 15. I don't want to listen to this crap, Dad. No, but so Elena, when she was born, she had some medical issues. And it meant that either my wife or I were going to need to be flexible, because there were going to be lots of medical appointments. And that fell to me just because of where we were. And so I kind of had to abandon that career of being a conductor, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because, there's not a lot of jobs and you have to be like 60 years old before you get the really good one. And I wasn't enjoying that necessarily. So I thought about, like, what do I know that I could do from home that would make money? And I knew a little bit about recording at the time, because I'd been involved in music. I'd been in bands. I'm a drummer too. In college, I was in an a cappella group, and I was like, oh yeah, I know a cappella. And I've been working in this music thing for a little while here. I could record a cappella groups. And I kind of built up this a cappella recording studio in my house. Grew it to the point that we actually moved to Nashville, and I had a recording studio in Nashville in my house. And I just I started listening to podcasts when I was riding my bike, to learn a little bit more about business. I listened to Michael Hyatt. That's when I met Mike Kim for the first time, and some of that group, Jeff Goins, and started listening to Pat Flynn as well. And they were helping me, and I was like, I'm learning stuff, and I'm learning how to make my life better and improve my business. But I was getting frustrated with working with musicians, because, projects will last a year. Musicians aren't the best at budgeting sometimes. So I was like, how can I diversify? How can I do something with my business that doesn't really change it too much, but makes more money and things like that? So one of the things that I started to do was listen to these podcasts. And then I noticed, hey, some of these podcasts don't really sound that great. They were like too soft, or you could tell they were using their built-in microphone on their computer and things like that. So I started reaching out, and I was like, hey, can I help you? And I started doing it for free. I was editing some podcasts, and then I met some more people, and then they started paying me. And then they asked me, hey, can you write this for us too? Can you do our show notes? Can you publish this here? Do you know anything about Instagram? Like, all those sorts of things started to happen. And over the last 8 years now, it's grown from being a music recording studio to now being a full-time podcast production company, where we have over 40 clients that we are helping them launch their podcast, about 12 to 15 a year, and then manage and produce their podcasts and publish and grow their podcasts each and every week. So it was a long path, like I think a lot of us have that are in this world. But that's how I got to where we are at this point.
It's very interesting. We have similar intersections with our story, our origin story, because um, one of the reasons that I chose to become a business owner, there's a whole bunch of motivations, but one of the reasons that really pushed me to start my business was back in 2013. I discovered that my ex-wife had become an alcoholic, and the kids had to move in with me full time. But more importantly, they needed to get supports that were pretty time consuming. Each of them needed to see a therapist. They were going to Alateen meetings, which are meetings for teenagers, young adults, that are like AA is for alcoholics, and then Al-Anon is for family members of alcoholics, and Alateen is for kids who are family members of alcoholics. But they each wanted to go to their own Alateen meeting. So I had 3 separate meetings, 3 separate therapists that I was, taking the kids to, and you can imagine what that was as far as time consumption, and that was every week. So that really was the thing that pushed me to be like, okay, I don't need to keep begging for time off to be able to make this happen, or only doing it at night where, when the kids now, they're so busy with their therapy that they don't have a life, kind of thing. And that really was the thing that pushed me to finally do something that I had wanted to do for a very long time. I got married at 19. I had my first daughter when I was 19 years old. You actually met her earlier, Mimi, who produces this show. And she, when she came, I had this sense of responsibility that I never felt like I could go out and start a business, because I was always needing to provide for my family. But when it became the actual thing that I needed in order to provide for their needs at the moment, it was an easy decision. Of course, I didn't jump in and quit my job and start my business separately. I started on the side and grew it. But interestingly, that's where we intersect is this medical support for our child was really the thing that drove us to become an entrepreneur. So very interesting. Love your story.
Yeah, thank you.
And happy birthday to your daughter. Really happy about your journey. It's really cool. So I want to jump right into it. This is a podcast for law firm owners, and you haven't specified that you work specifically with law firm owners, but in the green room, you told me that you work primarily with professional services individuals. So law firm owners included. So let's talk about the law firm owner. Let's talk about let's start with the basics. Like there's only so much available as far as time and as far as money when it comes to marketing, right? And the owner needs to decide, where am I going to spend my time? Where am I going to spend my money? And it's very nice for us to sit here and spend an hour recording an episode talking about how great a podcast is. And actually, I as a fan of podcasting, I do think that there could be a lot of power in having a podcast. But how does somebody navigate whether that is the thing that they should be spending their time or investing in?
Sure. Well, what occurred to me really early on when I started meeting my first lawyers, or like Ernie Svensson, who's a law firm systemization coach who used to be a lawyer, and he's also a podcaster now, and started out as a blogger. It started to occur to me that when you need a lawyer, it is usually something big is happening, something major, something scary, something all of a sudden. Kind of like if you end up in the emergency room, you weren't planning to be there usually. And so as I met lawyers, I started to hear about how it's so hard to get good quality leads. And that's why, a lot, like we talked about our friend Mark, who their job is to really make it so that your website is easy to find, that your website is higher up in search results, so that the ads that you put out there get more clicks, that people who come to your site know that you can help them right away. But that still doesn't make anyone feel comfortable. I compare it to therapists, where when you need a therapist, this is someone who you're going to talk to and you're going to tell some of your most intimate details about your life. A lawyer is very similar. How do you feel comfortable right away walking into that person's office and working with them? And what I knew from working in podcasting at the time was, well, when people listen to podcasts, like you said, they listen everywhere. It's really convenient for them. They can listen at all times. Like the average podcast listener subscribes to 6 shows. They listen to, half hour, an hour, hour and a half of audio content a day. They very quickly build these relationships with the host of a podcast that is more like a friendship. We have a client, Michelle, who's a therapist, who she started a podcast to reach more people because she was only helping 22 people a week in her practice. And fast forward a few years of having a podcast, she went on vacation to Spain. She lives in North Carolina, and walked into a drugstore, a pharmacy in Spain, in Barcelona, and the lady behind the counter recognized her and was a podcast listener. And all of a sudden they struck up a conversation and they were friends. They'd never met. And so I knew that like on my commutes, when I was listening to podcasting before I started my own thing, I felt like I was hanging out with people that I knew and liked. And I still do when I'm out riding my bike. The sports talk podcasts that I listen to, those are my buddies, and so I knew that. I'm like, wow, okay, podcasting could really help lawyers by breaking down that discomfort a little bit. And then I also knew, wow, all of the things that I've done in my business have been from advice from like 2 or 3 podcasters that I eventually, joined their masterminds or hired them as a coach or whatever. And why did I do that? Why did I spend all that money? Well, it was because I trusted them, because I'd been listening to them for hours and I knew they were an expert and I trusted their authority. And I was like, okay, what if lawyers could do something, create content where even if it's just on their website, it gives people a window into who they are as a person and what it's like to work with them. I had a recent experience. So I live in Central Florida, and every house in Central Florida almost has solar panels. So I was like, we got to get solar panels because it's like really cool. And the state has a law that the HOA can't prevent you from getting solar panels, so it's really great. And so what did I do? I went to Google My Business and I started searching for solar panel companies. And in Central Florida, there's probably 1 million companies that will install solar panels. So who's good? Just like there's 1 million lawyers out there. Okay, if I need an estate planner, estate law, there's like 1,000 lawyers in Central Florida. So it's the same thing. And so I went to Google My Business. I picked the few that were highly rated, and then I set up meetings to meet with those people. And after having the meetings, I picked the one that seemed to know the most and I liked the most, that I trusted the most. And at the dinner table, signing the contract or this agreement for these solar panels, I said to the guy, I was like, hey, like, if you had a blog on your site or you had 5 episodes of a podcast that talked about solar panels and what you just told me in this meeting, I would have hired you without having a meeting. Like I would have picked you over the other 3 because I could hear who you were. And so that's what I started to tell lawyers, was that really this is a no-brainer. If you're going to create content of some type, if you've thought about having a blog, or if you already have a blog, or if you've got people telling you, you need to do a YouTube channel, a podcast is the place where you can start and create content. You can create this long form content. It can be 15 minutes long. It can be 20 minutes long, it can be 45 minutes long, whatever. But then you can take that 45 minutes, if you've recorded video while you're doing it, you can cut videos for Instagram Reels and TikTok, and you can take your transcript of your podcast and you can clip out quotes for social media posts. And then you can, if you have a content writer on staff or you have a great paralegal that's interested in doing some things, they could take your transcript and write a 500, 700 word blog post. So now you've got a blog post on your site in addition to your episode. And so that's what we started to do with our business, was provide a way for busy professional service providers to do one thing, whether it's a half day a month or, one morning a week or whatever they can fit in their schedule, is create content that then provides them content in all of the other channels that they need. And one of the things I like to tell people who aren't really, insiders like us in the podcast industry, is that podcast listeners, and we've done actually research on this, Edison Research has 93% of podcast listeners listen to more than half or all of every episode. And it's because of what you said. It's because it's so easy to listen. You put out a 30-minute episode, you're guaranteed that that person is spending 20 minutes with you, 30 minutes with you potentially. That just doesn't happen on YouTube. They might spend 5 minutes reading your blog, but they don't get to hear you. And so when you have a podcast, you just have that way of providing a chance for people to become friends with you.
Yeah, I love everything that you shared, and it's really true that podcasting creates that connection. From the experience as a listener, like I think that I know Michael Hyatt and Pat Flynn and Cliff Ravenscraft really, really well. I listened to them for years. I know all about Michael Hyatt's various medical ailments throughout his journey, and I know the different places he's worked, and I know that I know things about his wife and his daughter and his like all the things that he shared through little breadcrumbs throughout the journey and the experience. Pat Flynn and his journey, as starting as an architect and then, leaving that to go into online marketing and that whole journey. This was even before his son was born, and now his his kid is like probably a preteen or a teenager at this point. It's just very interesting to know. And by the way, I never met Michael Hyatt in person, but Pat Flynn I met in person a number of times, and so I've gotten to connect with him personally, which I'm sure you probably have as well, because he's highly active in the podcasting space.
Yeah.
But let's turn this conversation back around to our listeners here.
Sure.
So I buy into the fact that podcasting as a medium is a great medium to really make that connection. I understand. Your solar panel story is a great example or highlight of how powerful a podcast can be. And for us personally, we sell a $20,000 coaching program. And most of our clients come, they may not come from the podcast, but they are podcast listeners.
Right.
So
yeah.
we're not heavily actively promoting it here on the podcast, but we talk about it. We share experiences about it, and then we create other events that somebody attends, and ultimately they end up there. And by the way, folks, if you need help with growing your law firm, and this is something you would like to learn more about, just go to profitwithlaw.com/elite, profitwithlaw.com/elite, ELITE. Everything that you need to know is there. And then you can get on a call with us and see if we have an open spot available at the moment, that you check it out. But circling back, so there are two types of podcasts that somebody can create. One is a podcast that is specific to what they do, and another is a more general show that has nothing to do with what they do. And I would like to know your thoughts for professional services people, right? Your solar panel example is great, but if that solar panel person had a podcast about things to do in Orlando, I don't know, would that have had the same effect as, here are the 5 questions you should be asking before installing solar panels, and then have an episode for each question going deep into it. When it comes to attorneys launching their own show, because many of them are a geography-based business, should they be focusing on the demographic, on the geography, to create something that is appealing and compelling to everybody there? Or should they be creating a show that has to do with the specific practice area that they're working in?
Yeah. And I like that you asked that, because I can tell you and I think the same way about these things, and we see the complications of it. There is actually a really easy way to answer that question. And there's a single answer to that issue of which side do you do? And it is really, for lawyers especially, what is the show that you can do that focuses, and we hear about niches and all the time, and be an inch wide and a mile deep. What is the show that you can do that focuses in on your ideal client or ideal listener as much as possible? So I'll give you examples. because I have law firm examples that go all different ways here. You've got like I have a client who is an immigration lawyer, and specifically her firm works with tech startups because she's in Silicon Valley, and works with a lot of tech startups, because they, even now when they've laid off a lot of people, there's still startups happening all the time that need developers, coders, whatever, and there just aren't enough of them here in the United States. So she's helping people navigate all of the things that are changing in immigration law and the codes, to get the people they need from India, from China, from Australia, from wherever, to work for their business, and all the things that are changing. And she's done episodes recently when, you know, a lot of the people that were here on J1 visas got laid off. They've got 60 days to find a new job, right? Or they have to go home. So she did several episodes helping people navigate that. And she doesn't necessarily have to focus on Silicon Valley. She's focusing on an industry, and she's focusing on a small portion of that industry, which is the startups. So that helps her get notoriety. That podcast led to her getting an advice column in TechCrunch because she was giving specific type of advice to a specific group of people that helped them out. On the other hand, I had a client who did a short run podcast who lives in Louisiana and is in a small town in Louisiana, sort of a bedroom community of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, because it's kind of in between. And he's a personal injury attorney. It's like, I'm not going to talk about personal injury because there's a million personal injury attorneys out there. There's already a million personal injury law podcasts, and it's boring. There's only so many episodes I can do talking about, here's how the insurance companies are trying to screw you on this, and here's this. And he's like, yeah, I could interview some clients. I often talk with lawyers about, get some clients who've had success with you to share their stories on your podcast. Even if you don't do a podcast about your law firm and your area of law in particular, get some clients on so people know what it's like to work with you. But what this client did was he decided to start a podcast where he was the digital mayor of the town. He talked about the town. He talked about how he lived there and grown up there. He talked about the restaurants he liked. He recommended other service professionals in the area, like mechanics that he'd used forever. He would interview notable people in the area, like the principal of the high school who was retiring after a few decades, and a linebacker who went to high school there and then went on to LSU and had come back and started a nonprofit. He became sort of a like I said, the digital mayor of the area. And so now he's the lawyer that everybody knows in that area. If they don't need a personal injury attorney, they still go to him because he can then refer them to people. So it's that type of thing where, like, if I was a lawyer in Central Florida, no, I would not do a podcast about Orlando. Even though surprisingly, there aren't that many great Orlando tourism podcasts. There are a lot of Disney podcasts. There are a lot of, things like that. But I might not do that in Orlando. I might if I was in a family law podcast, I might do a podcast about family law. And if there was a certain area of family law that most of my clients came from that I was really good at, and I felt like I helped a lot of people in, I might focus on that. And I might focus on the news and the issues and the things that we run into, and changes in law in Florida, if that's where I am. Bringing on clients, families, people like that I've helped, that are willing to tell their stories. Because there's an element of, especially with lawyers, where you can't necessarily can't give advice, right? Or you have to be worried about compliance. I run into this with financial planners too, but you can tell stories, you can share experiences. And, I mentioned that word referral earlier, with the lawyer getting referrals and being able to refer people to other lawyers. But that's, to me, the key for podcasting, is that it really is like referral marketing on a grand scale. And if you're a business owner, if you're a small firm attorney, if you're a solo lawyer out there, I mean, myself, probably 2/3 of my clients either were direct referrals, people who heard me on a podcast, or people who heard me interviewed on a podcast, that came to me as clients because they trusted me. And we as business owners get most of our clients from referrals as we're starting out until we, scale to the point where we've got a machine that is really generating more leads. And so with a podcast, because you've got listeners who are listening to you and they consider you a friend and they've got a problem, and who do they trust? Well, they trust you. So they ask you how to solve their problem, and you happen to have the solutions to their problem because that's your area. It truly is referral marketing. That's the definition of referral marketing. It's just you're talking to 100 people at a time. Even if you're a small podcaster starting out and you've got 50 downloads an episode, that's still 50 people that you're talking to every episode. 50 people that are listening to you for 75% of your episode. And then it becomes 100 in a week or two. And then 3 months down the line, it might be 300 an episode if you're growing fast. And eventually it might be thousands of people per episode. I talked about Michelle, the therapist earlier. She went from nothing to 6 years later having tens of thousands of listeners every episode that she's helping. So I always try to get back to that, because whatever choice you make in terms of what your content is on your show, it really comes down to who is the listener that you're trying to help, and what is the best way to help them, or what is the best way to connect with them.
Now, how does somebody navigate? So they're an attorney in a specific geographic area. They don't serve, people nationwide. Now, there are certain attorneys that do, like trademark attorneys probably serve everybody across the country. Immigration law is federal law usually. So it's, somebody could potentially serve people across the country if they're not actually going to court for them. How does somebody who is geographic specific navigate this mindset block that here I'm going to be putting in all this effort to put out a show, but that show I could have 10,000 listeners, but who's to say that any of them are in my little, spot on the map? They could all be out in California, and I'm in Ohio. So how do you get around that issue?
Well, luckily with lawyers, what I found is they already know a good deal about how important SEO is, because the digital marketing companies have done a really good job of connecting with lawyers, because that has been important. It's like, okay, you're one of 10 estate law firms in this one city. How do you compete? Or you're one of 100 or whatever. And so they get that, oh, if I talk about this, or if I write this and these words are used, these key phrases that are really important to my firm and are what we do and what we do well, that will get us noticed. And it's the same thing on a podcast. If your podcast can have the name of your area in the title, that's a great step forward, because chances are, unless you're in a major city, there aren't too many podcasts that talk specifically about your city, your town, your area of a suburb of a major city or whatever. And so that can help get you noticed. And then you can talk about the area that you're of law that you're practicing, and maybe specific issues. And then you have episodes each week where the episode title can get to a specific term, a specific issue, a specific change in something that has gone on that people need to know about. That can help you get discovered. Because to take a step back, the way people find podcasts is the same way that they find your website. The number one way people find a podcast still is a web search, is going to Google and searching. I mean, how did I find your podcast to pitch you to have me come on as a guest? I searched podcast talking about content marketing with lawyers and building trust or something like that. I came up with a phrase, and your podcast was like one of the top 5 or 6 that came up. So that's how people are finding a podcast. They have a question, they want it answered, they go into Google, and Google is right now featuring, well, once you go past the ads, and everybody goes past the ads, that's like standard practice now. They see images, videos, and podcasts are up top, way before websites and pages and blogs and all that. You have to keep going down to get to those. So they're finding a podcast the same way. And podcast listeners, which there are many of now, it's more than half of Americans are listening to podcasts each week. They would rather listen to a podcast, just like a lot of people would rather listen to an audiobook, because they're commuting, because they're busy, because they're doing other things, all that we talked about earlier. So they're finding your content that looks like it has an answer to the question, so they're listening. and it's really easy for them to follow your podcast. You know, you're doing, as a podcaster, you're doing a good job if you're reminding them, hey, before you go forward in this episode, hit that plus button in the upper right hand corner of Apple Podcasts, so they keep getting the content pushed to you. And podcast listeners, it's convenient, they want to listen to it, they start listening to it, they are more likely then to follow your content and then go back to the beginning of your podcast. We see that every month with our clients, 10 to 20% of their downloads coming from episode 1 through 5. So people follow you and then they binge a lot of content. So when you start doing a good job as a podcast content creator, you are creating content that is searchable, good titles, SEO keyword rich titles that people can find, because after Google, they will look in podcast apps and use podcast apps as a search engine. It's the same way that YouTube is the second largest search engine, different type of content, but people will go on YouTube. How do I fix this thing on my sink? How do I do this? And that stuff shows up. In a podcast, generally they're asking questions to bigger issues. You know, how do I, get divorced? How do I do this? Like whatever. And people want to know that information. Because after Google, then they've got, family, friends, colleagues are recommending stuff. But then the third way that people find podcasts is they use the apps as search engines now. So that's how you get past it. Is you got to think of, I like to talk about marketing in terms of investment strategy. You have your short-term investments, which are your ads. Okay, you're going to pay money to get eyeballs really quick. Your medium-term investments are social media. You're going to do something on a regular basis to keep in touch with people, try to get a little bit of engagement, but show people what you're doing. And then your long-term investments are where you really build trust. That's your podcast, that's your blog, that's your YouTube channel, where people are spending time with you. And those people, like we talked about earlier, are more likely to trust you enough to actually click on that contact button on your website or call your office or whatever, because they've gotten to know you, they've gotten that touch point. So that's how I talk to potential podcasters about how to get past that. Is that you've kind of got to do all forms of marketing. And the podcast is that space where you can do it. You can create a bunch of the other things from it. And you can just as easily reach people with all the SEO and keyword stuff that you're doing on your website anyway.
Yeah, I love what you shared with the, hey, it's going to show up in search. And, Google does a good job of matching not just the results that are relevant to you, but also the relevancy to the location where you're searching from. So you might actually rank higher in search.
Yeah.
Your podcast might rank higher in search locally than it might in other places in the country. When somebody's asking a question that to Google seems like a local response would be more relevant. And Google does a really good job with that. So I haven't even thought about that, where, that's how people are finding it. So that's a really good point. Another point that you didn't touch on that I think is good, and you can add it to your tool chest, is in the legal community, there's a certain reciprocal effect. And the more lawyers that the more your network grows. And what happens is if somebody hears your show and they need your services, but they're not in your geographic area, they might reach out anyway and say, hey, I'm a podcast listener. Do you know a family law attorney in my area? Because, I respect you and I respect anybody you're going to refer me to. Now, if you don't know somebody, go develop a relationship with somebody, send them a client, and you never know when that opportunity might be for them to send somebody back your way.
That's a good point. Like that actually happened to me recently, because so I work with, we're launching a podcast for Atticus, which is a law firm coaching program called Great Practice, Great Life. And we'd been working on their podcast, getting to know them and all sorts of things. And they do a conference down here in Orlando that we had a booth at. And with my daughter, we have a special needs trust. And we started it, more than a decade ago, and wrote all these documents in Virginia when we lived in Virginia. And we changed some things around. Then I started to think, well, we live in Florida now. We're probably not moving. I should probably make sure this works in Florida. And I was like, I don't know any lawyers in Central Florida yet. Oh, but I do know this giant law firm coaching program that has lawyers all over the country. And I know at that conference, I saw at least 20 estate lawyers. And so I just reached out to them and said, hey, could you refer me to an estate lawyer in Central Florida? And they gave like 3 or 4 that they coach and trust and are recommending. So yeah, it definitely, it works that way.
Yeah. And we don't have enough time to dive into this really, because we got to wrap it up right now. But you did mention that you have a client who has I think you described it as short run podcast.
Yeah.
Can you just spend 2 seconds explaining what a short run podcast is?
Sure. Yeah. And I will tell you, the most effective podcasts are podcasts like yours that show up on a regular basis. They're consistent. They come out every week at the same time on the same day. They keep going. I tell most podcasters, if you're not ready to do this for 6 months to a year, don't start, because it really is about consistency. It's about showing up. It's about building trust. And that's not hard. I mean, like I said, you can do a half a day a month, record 3 interviews in the afternoon, and then one morning, another day in the month, record 3 20-minute solo episodes about specific practice areas that you're talking about. And then you've got 6 weeks of content. And if you do that next month, you're a month ahead, and then you're 2 months ahead. So it's not hard to do that and keep going. But if you know, like, okay, I'm doing this, I have a law firm that's really focused on this one specific area and nobody else is talking about it. There's no content out there about it. There's this recent change. What I'm going to write a couple of blogs about it. Well, if you're going to do that, why not just record 3 or 4 episodes about it, or 10 episodes about it, take people through it, and then you can update them in the future. But even if you only have those episodes on your website, it's like what I talked about with the solar panel company. You've now got information for people that they can, you want to have it more than your website. It's really easy to get it into podcast directories. And that's kind of what we help people with too. You get it out there so that anyone can find it. Even if they, like you said, live halfway across the country, they might have a question and need it answered and find your podcast and listen to it. And then they reach out to you because you've got it there. There are people now, like you've seen and I've seen, that only reach out to people that they have, they've listened to on a podcast. Like if I'm looking for someone to do work in my business, like we recently last year rebuilt our website. It had been a glorified brochure forever because I built it, really early on in the business. I reached out to a legitimate SEO person to rebuild our site, do all the things that we needed to do. And yeah, we jumped from the 3rd page of Google to the 1st page when we did that. But I didn't know who to talk to. And so I started talking, okay, who do I listen to? Who are my mentors? Who are the people I listen to podcasts that talk about this stuff that, oh, I heard this guest on here. Let me interview that person. Let me work with that person. That's what I did. So that's really what you need to do, even if it's just 4 episodes, even if it's just 10 episodes, 5 episodes, 6, whatever would be appropriate. I think when I have calls with especially lawyers, chiropractors, you think about someone like that sort of does the same thing or a few different techniques with a bunch of different people, they think, oh, well, I don't have that much to talk about. I have probably only got like a couple episodes to talk about. And then we get into it and I start asking them questions about, what problems are they trying to solve? What really pisses them off about like what society is doing right now? And then they start to realize, oh, I could talk about that. And that thing that I thought was 1 episode is actually like 4 episodes. And then I'm going to bring in this colleague that I'm going to interview in the 5th episode to go even deeper into it because there's information out there. And then, once I start my podcast, I should probably start being interviewed as a guest on other podcasts and using other people's platforms to reach more people, because I could go on that platform and talk about something really general and say, hey, this thing I just mentioned, you could go back to episode 6 of my podcast where I talk about it way more in depth. And then you've got more audience people coming in. And then the more audience people come in, you start getting emailed questions about like, oh, like you mentioned this, could you explain that more, or could you talk about this, or I have this problem. You start getting topics to talk about, and you get feedback, and then your podcast that you thought was going to be 10 episodes all of a sudden becomes 50 episodes. And I can't tell you how many of our clients were professional services providers and then 3 years later are now professional podcasters. Where like even that immigration lawyer I talked about, it's mostly her firm that is doing the work now. She is creating content and reaching out to people and connecting with people and learning new things and sharing information. So like they actually moved out of their area of focus and it became a whole new business. So that's why I say don't underestimate what you're capable of.
Yeah, I love your response, and I'm gonna wrap it up now with one final thing, and that is one of the things that I talk to my clients about all the time is whenever you're faced with something, and this is not something earth shattering, that's like, oh, okay, Moshe just came up with this amazing concept, but there's a book out called Who Not How. And I love that term. I love that phrase, who not how. Whenever you decide, okay, I'm going to do something, what's the very next question but your knee-jerk reaction is, okay, how am I going to do this? And you gotta put the brakes on. You gotta say who, not how. And it's very, very important, especially when it comes to podcasting, because my entire commitment to my podcast is showing up for this interview. Everything else is done by someone else.
Yeah.
If I had to do all the things, this show would never happen. And I know that because I actually had a podcast. It's in the podcast directory. It's called Dream Builder Financial. It's 8 episodes long. And if you look at the release dates, you can see that I was super inconsistent. I was doing that one entirely on my own. Yeah. And just coming up with the topic I wanted to talk about would take me hours.
Well, you did Cliff's course. So you got all the equipment, and that's probably what you started doing was that.
Yeah, I actually did it. So I didn't go with the Heil and the mixer and all of that stuff. I didn't buy into needing all that tech. I have an ATR 2100, just a simple USB microphone.
Good.
Works perfectly fine for me. But I've got I have a staff member in the Philippines who does the audio editing. I have a separate staff member in the Philippines who does the loading of the episode into Libsyn, which is the place where everything is stored. And then I've got an outsourced agency that is doing all of the blog post writing and resource, listening to every episode and writing down all the resources that were mentioned and all that stuff. And then I have my a separate team that does the outreach and is finding me guests. Sometimes they come knocking on our door, but often we're going and seeking them out to fill our show. And I batch record. So I have 2 Tuesdays a month that the entire day is podcast recording, and I show up and I do my 5 recordings for the day. And every month we're batching 10. And why are we doing that when we release 1 a week? Because I want to have time off. So in the summer, I take 2 months off where I'm doing nothing. I literally do nothing in my business except for show up to coaching calls. And then I work in my kids' day camp. And get to hang out and spend time with them and experience summer with them. Part of our organization around the podcast production came about because I wanted to do that. And I wanted to have 3 months of episodes prepared and in the hopper and batched. All of this requires somebody to do it. If you don't have the team, you got to find somebody who can do all that for you. And Danny's that guy. So, Danny, I'm going to give you a chance here to close it out. I want you to share one last piece of wisdom with our audience, and I want you to tell them where to go if they want to take a next step with you. But folks, if podcasting is something that you like, you're thinking, hey, I could do this. You absolutely can. All it requires is the actual time of you behind the microphone. Everything else can be done for you. Danny can make that happen. Danny?
Yeah. Well, I think the best piece of advice I've ever gotten in business is to start ugly. You've heard the phrase done is better than perfect. I feel like the biggest mistake that a lot of podcasters make is they want to do a podcast. They've got a great idea for a podcast. but they haven't gotten that idea perfect yet. They don't know what types of episodes should I do? What format should I have? How often am I going to release it? What's the perfect title? They obsess over those things, and a year and a half goes by, and they haven't built an audience during that year and a half because they didn't just put it out there. So you got to start ugly, because just like I mentioned earlier, when you start ugly, you start developing an audience that can start giving you feedback and ask questions and can maybe send your podcast in an entirely different direction that you never even considered was out there. And that's kind of what we help people do at Emerald City Productions. You can find out more at emeraldcitypro.com, where if you're thinking, I want to do podcasting, but I definitely need a done for you service, someone that is going to help me at every step, that's what we do. We have 3 different options that people can take advantage of if they already have a podcast, or even if they're launching a podcast, where we go all the way from just producing their podcast and publishing it to really promoting it and doing a lot of the repurposing, like I was mentioning, to becoming their overall marketing strategist, where we are creating their marketing strategy centered around their podcast and building everything else out in terms of helping with their SEO and developing a YouTube channel from their podcast and all sorts of other things that we can do. So emeraldcitypro.com is the way to go there. We have a team of 12 now, mostly in North America: editors, copywriters, web developers, strategists, account managers. Really, you're only talking to me at the beginning. I'm the main strategist. I'm helping you launch the show and develop the show, but we've got a whole team as well. But if you're one of those people that you're like fiercely do it yourself, you can go to dannyosment.com/roadmap. And I have a free podcast roadmap there that's about a 25-point checklist of, if you're going to do it yourself, here's what you need to do in the right order, with the right equipment, the right things, so that you don't make mistakes, so that you don't launch your podcast and wonder why it's not an Apple podcast and you miss the whole fact that you had to connect it to the podcast directory. So emeraldcitypro.com or dannyosment.com/roadmap. And awesome. I'd love to talk to you. You can schedule a call with me at Emerald City Pro.
Awesome, Danny. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the knowledge that you shared today. Appreciate your time. Folks, we're going to link that up in the show notes. You can access the show notes for this and every other episode at profitwithlaw.com. Really hope that you come back and listen to the show again. As Danny said, any good podcaster would have plugged this at the beginning of the show. I'm clearly not a good podcaster. So if you're enjoying the show and you haven't yet subscribed to it, hit the plus button, hit the follow button in your podcast player so that you get notified every time we release a new episode. We're here at least once a week, every Thursday morning. Sometimes we pepper in some bonuses for you. When that happens, Christmas comes early, right? Like it's always an exciting thing to have an extra episode show up in your podcast player. But you can know, like clockwork, every Thursday morning, we'll be here with another episode for you. Great stuff, Danny. And folks, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, check him out. I mean, if you resonated with him today, you'll probably resonate with him working with him. And it's probably a good proof for you that you should be starting your own show, because that's what your clients are going to feel when they listen to you on a podcast. All right, take care. Until next time, let's keep that law firm profitable. That's it for this week's episode of Profit with Law. If you have enjoyed the show, please consider sharing it with at least one person. Imagine how many lives we can change if we each shared this episode. Another way to share the episode is on social media. We appreciate your support and look forward to you joining us again next week.